46 years ago, a government minister's body was found floating in just a few inches of the water in a forest pond. The official story was written almost instantly. Robert Boulin, a man at the height of his power, had taken his own life. A suicide of honor, they called it. A clean, tragic narrative to close a messy political chapter. But that clean narrative never quite held. The story kept changing. Whispers in the halls of power suggested it wasn't a suicide, but an execution. A message. Most people filed it away as a dark, unresolved footnote in French history. But what if it wasn't a footnote? What if it was the first chapter? The moment a single thread was pulled, beginning a slow unraveling that runs through 4 decades of secret deals, state-sanctioned lies, and political rot. That same thread runs all the way to today, right into the courtroom with a convicted ex-president, Nicolas Sarkozy. It seems impossible that a strange death in 1979 could explain a modern political scandal. But this is the story of how that single violent event wasn't just an old affair. It was the moment the French Republic decided that for those in power, the truth was far more dangerous than the lie. Wow. That opening really does set a high bar for what we're diving into today. We're talking about 4 decades of political crime, institutional decay, and really a kind of moral shift in the French political world. The sources we've looked at are just incredible, detailing how the Republic seemed to choose, well, self-preservation through fabrication over just being transparent. So our mission today is to follow that thread, that corrosive line of corruption and institutional failure, starting right back with that death in 1979 and trace it all the way up to now. We need to understand not just how deep this rot goes, but how the very idea of a political scandal in France has, well, fundamentally changed.
And I think what's really crucial to get here is the historical backdrop. French political life, going way back, has always had this tension, this struggle to balance the ideal of Republican virtue, this idea of a pure, almost sacred public sphere with the, let's be honest, messy reality of politics. You know, for a long time, big scandals like the Dreyfus affair were important because they actually defined public virtue by showing its violation. They provoked this intense collective outrage. But what we see starting around the late 70s is this huge, slow shift. The scandals didn't stop, actually. They seemed to multiply, to spread everywhere. But instead of sparking that same kind of indignation, now it seems to inspire more resignation, resignation rather than indignation. Corruption somehow lost its power to truly shock the nation. It went from being this existential threat to just an expected part of the political landscape.
Okay, so let's start right there then. With how institutional impunity really got established, say, between 1979 and into the 80s, this feels like the time when the political class started learning that lesson, that maybe truth costs more than a lie pays off.
The Robert Boulin affair, October 1979, is such a potent starting point. Boulin was a major figure, Minister of Labor under Raymond Barre, very powerful. So when his body turns up in shallow water in the forest of Rambouillet, the official story, suicide of honor, was just instantaneous. Too quick, right? Exactly. That immediate closure, kind of brushing aside weird forensic details, the sheer unlikeliness of the scene, it really suggested a top-level political decision was made fast to just contain whatever messy situation this was.
And like you said earlier, that clean narrative never quite held. The mystery lingered, the whispers about execution, the idea it was a political message that immediately made things feel volatile, unstable. It suggested maybe that if truth was disposable, the executive could get away with a lot.
And that volatility was reflected in everything happening around it.
Yeah.
Boulin's death is the same year as the Diamonds affair blows up. It makes you think this wasn't just one isolated tragedy, but maybe a symptom of a political climate where the highest offices were suddenly feeling very exposed, very scrutinized.
Right. And we have to talk about that normalization of, let's call it, presidential indulgence under Giscard d'Estaing, VGE. These early scandals weren't quite the systemic funding issues yet, were they? More about his personal style.
That's a good distinction. It was perceived arrogance, a sort of monarchical style that just felt wrong somehow for the Republic. The Diamonds affair, breaking in 79, involved VGE getting these incredibly expensive diamonds from Bokassa, the self-styled emperor of the Central African Empire.
Terrible timing, too, given Giscard helped depose him later.
Awful timing. And the press coverage was just brutal. They saw his acceptance of these gifts, plus his lifestyle, the hunting trips, the general extravagance. They didn't just see it as bad ethics. They called it forfeiture.
Okay, let's pause on that word, forfeiture. It sounds serious. What did it imply in that specific context?
It's a very strong term. It means an abuse of office, a betrayal of public trust. It wasn't just about taking a bribe. The argument was that VGE, by accepting kingly gifts and living like that, was acting less like a president and more like, well, an autocrat treating state resources as his own private property. It was that perceived shift from president to emperor that really got under people's skin.
And this idea of institutional cover-ups to protect the top, it gets reinforced by that other bizarre scandal, the sniffing airplanes fiasco.
Yeah.
Financially disastrous and, frankly, a bit absurd.
Oh, completely absurd. It ran from 76 to 79. The state energy company, Elf Aquitaine, somehow managed to waste over 700 million francs on these planes that were supposedly equipped with miracle technology to sniff out oil and gas from the air. Spoiler, the tech was fake.
700 million francs. I mean, what does that even mean in 1970s money? That sounds enormous.
It was huge. Think about it, 700 million francs back then. That was something like 10% of the entire annual budget for the French Ministry of Industry, enough to fund multiple actual large-scale projects. It wasn't just waste. It was a massive hemorrhage of public money on a known scam. And when the investigation started, things got political fast.
Right. Rumors started flying, and later evidence suggested that VGE himself and his Prime Minister Raymond Barre actively interfered with the financial investigation into ELF. And the excuse, the classic shield, national security.
So an early precedent was set right there. State secrecy, protecting the executive. That trumps public accountability no matter how much money goes down the drain.
Precisely. It showed the system was willing to protect itself, even from gross financial mismanagement.
But what's really striking, looking back, is that despite these huge scandals, a possible political killing, diamond bribes, 700 million francs just vanishing, the public reaction back then, in the late 70s, early 80s, seems kind of muted. That's the really key thing looking ahead. Despite all the media frenzy, the political noise, public opinion polls showed this surprising level of, well, the sources call it blasé indifference. By the late 70s, very few people actually thought their current leaders were more corrupt than leaders in the past.
So it wasn't throw the bums out. It was more like, yeah, this is just politics.
Exactly. They weren't seeing corruption as some new shocking threat. They were kind of internalizing it, accepting it as a maybe unfortunate but inevitable part of how things worked. And that cynicism, that public acceptance that maybe the lie is just part of the deal, that created the perfect environment for things to get worse, for corruption to shift from personal perks to something more systematic.
Which takes us right into Section 2. The systemic entrenchment of what the sources call alimentary politics, mainly through the 80s and 90s. This is where corruption stops being about one guy's fancy lifestyle and becomes the actual fuel for the political machines, right?
Yeah.
Creating this kind of osmosis between public money and political survival.
Yes, this period is all about institutionalizing illegal funding. Political parties, and this is important, across the board, left, right, center, set up these entities that looked legitimate on the surface. They were often called studies offices, which sounds harmless enough.
Okay, let's name names. For the socialists, it was URBA Technic, and the communists had GIFCO. What were these things actually doing? How did the money loop work?
The mechanism was brutally simple, really, and completely parasitic on local government funds. These studies offices basically acted as middlemen. Companies bidding on local government contracts, big stuff like municipal water concessions, often going to giants like Compagnie Générale d'Eau, or major construction projects like schools or roads. They'd have to pay massively inflated fees to these party-run offices for supposed consulting or services.
So if you're a construction company and you want that big school contract, you know you have to bake in a hefty kickback disguised as a study fee. That goes straight to the party's shell company.
Exactly. It guaranteed this steady, hidden, systematic flow of cash right into party coffers. Money they absolutely needed for campaigning, for running the party day to day.
And crucially, you said this wasn't initially about personal enrichment for the politicians themselves.
Not primarily, no. This was about funding the party machine, keeping it running, winning elections. The really critical thing is that when these schemes finally started getting uncovered, the investigations showed it was happening everywhere. It was cross-party guilt. It was like an unwritten national convention.
The Herb investigation, the one involving the socialists, that really shows how widespread it was, doesn't it? It didn't even start at the top.
No, it started almost by accident. A worksite accident in Limoges led to a local investigation, which then just snowballed. Journalists started calling it a Tour de France of corruption because it revealed this URBA mechanism was active in socialist-run towns all across the country. It eventually implicated huge parts of the party leadership, leading to convictions from major figures like Henri Emanueli. Local officials felt they had to participate to funnel money up to the national party.
And on the other side of the aisle, the RPR, Jacques Chirac party, they had their own version running, especially leveraging their control over Paris and the wider region.
Oh, absolutely. They had a couple of main methods. First, they used Paris City Hall funds to pay salaries for party workers who had phantom jobs, basically, people on the city payroll who only worked for the RPR party. Second, they systematically took commissions from construction companies, especially those building high schools in the Ile-de-France region.
And who were the big names caught up in that RPR network, just to show the level it reached?
Well, Michel Roussin, who'd been Chirac's chief of staff at Paris City Hall, he got convicted for handling those construction commissions for the RPR. But even bigger, Alain Juppé, Chirac's key ally, later prime minister, he was convicted for his role in the fundraising, and specifically for using those city funds to pay party salaries via the phantom jobs.
Wow, a former prime minister convicted for essentially running an illegal payroll system funded by the city. That really is the definition of alimentary politics, isn't it? Feeding the party with public funds. The conclusion seems unavoidable. These scandals expose systems running silently and widely across all parties for who knows how long.
And this systemic corruption arguably reached its absolute peak, certainly its most spectacular and financially devastating peak, with the ELF scandal. That really spanned the 90s into the early 2000s. ELF Aquitaine, the state energy giant, became the ultimate symbol of this fusion of money and politics.
ELF basically acted like a state within a state, with its own secret global slush fund, didn't it?
That's a good way to put it. The investigations uncovered these incredibly complex global systems of corruption. They found huge black treasure chests, basically. Off-the-books funds managed through a web of offshore accounts, shell companies, tax havens. This allowed ELF to funnel seemingly endless amounts of money around the world to achieve political goals, diplomatic aims, business deals, often blurring the lines between all three.
Can we get specific? What were some of the really audacious deals that came to light?
One of the biggest involved the acquisition of the Leuna refinery in former East Germany right after reunification. Investigations pointed to massive illegal payments, not just as standard business bribes, but potentially as political kickbacks to parties in both France and Germany to smooth the way for this very sensitive deal. And then there were the huge secret payments ELF made to various leaders, often dictators, in Africa. This was basically ELF acting as a parallel foreign policy arm for France, ensuring access to resources and maintaining influence.
And maybe the most infamous case, the one that perfectly shows the mix of state business and personal corruption, was the link to Foreign Minister Roland Dumas.
Ah, yes, the Dumas affair. It just perfectly captured the decadence of the system. Dumas's mistress, Christine de Vere-Joncourt, was put on the ELF payroll. She got something like 60 million francs over several years for doing essentially nothing, maybe some vague consulting. The sources highlight she used some of this incredible sum to buy lavish gifts for Dumas himself, things like expensive crocodile boots, rare ancient statues.
60 million francs.
Yeah.
And this is happening while Dumas is the foreign minister, potentially overseeing or involved in huge state deals, like the sale of French frigates to Taiwan, a deal ELF was also deeply involved in facilitating.
Exactly. You have the highest level of statecraft possibly being influenced or lubricated by tens of millions in private illegal payments flowing through the minister's mistress via the state oil company. It just showed how deeply embedded corruption had become, how it wasn't just a side effect, but part of the actual machinery of high-level politics and even diplomacy.
So faced with this the RPR schemes, ELF, this massive systemic cross-party corruption, you'd historically expect some kind of public explosion, maybe even a political upheaval. But again, things seem relatively why?
Well, it comes back to that normalization we talked about earlier. By 1994, polls showed 70% of French people just saw corruption as inevitable in modern society. It wasn't that they didn't know it was happening. It was this deep, ingrained cynicism. Voters had already kind of written off the whole political class as intrinsically dishonorable. And here's the really critical disconnect, especially economically and civically. When people were asked about their priorities, getting rid of corruption ranked way down the list, far below things like unemployment or crime, things that felt like immediate personal threats. The corruption was understood, sure, it cost a fortune, it was an economic drag, but it felt like a known cost, maybe even a stable one. People seemed willing to tolerate these, let's say, corrupt managers, as long as the overall managerial state kept delivering the basics, jobs, security, services. That public apathy, in effect, just gave a green light to the whole system of elementary politics.
Okay, so this Resignation, this focus on personal security over demanding public virtue. That leads us right into our third major theme, the resulting crisis of institutional integrity. This is where the system starts to push back, particularly the justice system, right? And it starts trying to turn political responsibility, which politicians could always sort of manage, into actual criminal liability, which is much harder to escape.
Absolutely. And that shift is maybe best seen in the contaminated blood affair back in the 80s and 90s. That's where the line between political failure and criminal guilt just completely fractured.
The background, just to remind everyone, was tragic. The government's slow reaction and systemic failures allowed HIV-infected blood products to be used, leading to thousands of infections and deaths, a catastrophic public health failure.
And the state's failure, its inaction really, forced a kind of revolutionary legal change. Traditionally, if ministers messed up while in office, they were answerable only to Parliament, a political body likely to protect its own. But the sheer scale of this tragedy, the public horror, led directly to the creation of a new court, the Court of Justice of the Republic, the CJR.
Why was creating the CJR such a big deal, institutionally speaking?
Because for the first time, it meant ministers could face criminal prosecution for decisions made or not made while in government. It broke that old shield of political immunity. Suddenly, major figures like former Prime Minister Laurent Fabius, Social Affairs Minister Georgina Dufoy, they were literally hauled before a court facing jail time, not just political embarrassment. The state was being held criminally accountable for failing in one of its core jobs, protecting people's health and lives via the systems it controlled.
And this new legal reality led to that incredibly famous and quite revealing defense from Georgina Dufoy, responsible but not guilty.
That phrase just captures the whole shift perfectly. She admitted political responsibility, administrative responsibility for the massive failure of the system, but she absolutely denied any criminal intent, any personal guilt. The judges were trying to hold her criminally liable for institutional negligence. She was arguing it was just a political mistake. But the public, importantly, was demanding individual justice, compensation for the personal harm suffered. It showed that the idea of the state as this sacred entity was dissolving. People wanted competence from their manager and compensation when the manager failed.
Now, beyond negligence and system failure, the sources also point repeatedly to something maybe more deliberate. The executive actively misusing state security and police powers. Old habits of control, perhaps, the sort of Barbussa's-era tactics lingering on.
Yes, the use of these parallel, shadowy security units by the executive branch is a recurring theme, a real stain on the Fifth Republic's record. You can go back to the Ben Barka affair in 1965, the kidnapping and probable murder of the Moroccan opposition leader on French soil. The huge public outcry back then about French state complicity showed that the government's favorite justification, raison d'etat, the reason of state, couldn't just automatically silence the press or the opposition anymore.
Right, raison d'etat. Could you just unpack that a bit? What does it really mean in this context?
It's basically the argument that the state's highest interests, national security, justify any action, even if it's illegal or immoral. But the Ben Barka case showed that even when the government invoked raison d'etat, the press and even parts of the judiciary were starting to push back to expose the moral cost, to question the state's right to commit crimes in secret. And this suspicion of dirty tricks from within the state machine popped up again very clearly during the Markovitch affair in 1968. Remember, the murder of a bodyguard linked, through rumors, to the wife of Georges Pompidou, who was then prime minister and aiming for the presidency. Pompidou himself was convinced it was a smear campaign orchestrated by Gaullist agents within the state security services using state power to ruin his chances. These weren't just crimes, they felt like internal political warfare using the state's own tools.
And this pattern of abusing state security really hit a peak under President François Mitterrand with the Élysée wiretap scandal, the Deal d'Élysée.
Oh, the exposure of Mitterrand's special anti-terrorist unit was a massive turning point. Because it turned out this unit wasn't just targeting terrorists, it was wiretapping French journalists like Edwy Plenel at Le Monde, simply because their reporting was annoying the president. This was a direct, blatant presidential attack on press freedom and the rule of law.
And the reaction to that was huge, wasn't it? It really changed things institutionally.
It absolutely did. The protests were furious, not just from the press, but crucially from judges and magistrates themselves. They demanded that the judiciary had to be totally independent, free from political meddling, free from presidential interference. And that outrage created the political momentum for a long, slow push over decades to elevate the judiciary from being just an authority within the state historically weaker than the executive to become becoming a genuine independent power strong enough to actually check the executive branch.
So this tension, this fight between an increasingly assertive judiciary wanting independence and an executive branch trying to keep control, that's been the enduring conflict ever since, hasn't it?
It's the constant battleground for institutional integrity. Through the 90s and 2000s, judges felt more empowered, often backed by public opinion, fed up with corruption, and they went after political figures much more aggressively. But the executive keeps pushing back. Remember that incident in 2006? Nicolas Sarkozy, then Interior Minister, publicly tore into the judges at the Bobigny court, accusing them of being too soft on crime.
And the judiciary's response was immediate and united, right?
Instantaneous. Huge protests came from magistrates' associations from the highest courts. It just shows those battle lines are still drawn very clearly. The executive still feels it has the right to weigh in on justice, maybe even direct it, while the judiciary fights tooth and nail to defend the separation of powers it fought so hard to achieve, largely thanks to exposing all these earlier abuses and corruption scandals.
Okay, so we followed this thread for 4 decades. From a suspicious death, shrouded in official lies, through these massive systems of corruption like URBA and ELF, and into these huge institutional battles over who really holds the power, the politicians or the judges. So what's the takeaway? What does this long internal transformation really mean for the French Republic today?
I think the big result is what you could call the demystification of the state. The state has lost that almost sacred, symbolic quality it once had. It's no longer this unifying force demanding loyalty, virtue, collective sacrifice. Instead, it's seen much more now as a managerial state. Its main job is seen as providing services, managing birth, education, healthcare, security, pensions. So now, when the state fails, like with the contaminated blood, or when corruption gets too costly, it's not seen as a betrayal of the nation's soul. It's seen more like a breach of contract by an inefficient, expensive manager.
And that changes fundamentally how people react when they do get angry, right? It's not about collective political ideals anymore.
Exactly. The indignation now tends to be very individualized. It's a demand for personal justice, for reparation. People expect compensation, protection from this managerial state. They see themselves less as citizens responsible for upholding a republic, and maybe more like clients demanding their entitlements from a service provider that's let them down. They don't necessarily demand political purity anymore. They want their job security, their healthcare sorted, and compensation when the state messes up.
So that single thread pulled back in 1979. That moment, the Republic perhaps chose the convenient lie. It didn't cause a revolution, did it? It led to something slower, more internal.
It led to a long-term institutional erosion, yes. The kind of corruption that might have brought down earlier French republics has now become, in many ways, institutionalized and critically normalized. The Republic, having shed much of its symbolic sacred weight, has sort of turned into this ongoing contract without end with its citizens. And those citizens increasingly prioritize their personal entitlements and security over any sense of collective duty or the old pursuit of Republican virtue. They've largely resigned themselves to the background noise of corruption as long as the system, broadly speaking, delivers.